every problem that people present, you look back like a decade, I'm like, why is this going to fail? Like, oh, we're going to run out of oil. Oh, we figured out oil and gas. Like, we figured out fracking. Like, that's amazing. All of these different challenges, people just kind of like keep figuring out solutions to. And at some point, you just got to be like, I don't know. Again, like left curve it and be like, I don't know how we're going to figure this one out, but like, it seems like we're probably going to figure this one out.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Work. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks, and this is a show made up of long-form interviews with talented people using their careers to make the world a better place. My guest today is a guy named Packy McCormick. He's the founder and author of notboring.co. It's one of the best and most interesting publications on all of Substack, in my opinion, of course. It's about tech and startups at the bleeding edge of the frontier of what's possible with technology. He writes with a unique personality and perspective on where technology is going, how companies are being built, the founders behind them, and the trends that he sees. I think some of his best pieces are the weirdest pieces when you set out to read them, and then they become kind of part of this pantheon or body of work that he's built over time that is super fascinating and extremely unique. Packy has gone on to use the platform he built, sending his newsletter to over 200,000 subscribers to make a couple new things. The first thing is a podcast called The Age of Miracles. Its first season is about nuclear energy, and we get into some of both the making of the podcast and nuclear energy as a topic in this episode. He also started a venture capital fund called Not Boring Capital, where they fund some of the types of companies that he used to only write about. So he's got a really unique business model. He started off as a solo creator, writing and researching on his own, and now he's built it into a small empire of fascinating entities and publications and funds that he's working all to fuel this technology ecosystem that is at the core of his writing. So please enjoy my interview with Packy McCormick. Let's get going. I think this is the perfect moment in time to be interviewing you, especially in long format, because you were on this like 3-year heater at Not Boring, where you went from 0 to 25,000 plus subscribers year one, and then you grew like 250% the next year to almost 100,000 subscribers, and then you doubled again in 2022. One of the things I love to do when I'm interviewing folks that have work online is many people write year-end reviews or like kind of reflecting back. And so I'm reading all your year-end reviews, and it's like 2020, optimistic through the roof, 2021, optimistic through the roof, 2022, optimistic through the roof. And then 2023, of course, it was like headwinds everywhere, not just for you, but like everywhere. The tech sector, startups, investing. And so Not Boring's growth slowed a little bit too. And it wasn't just audience, which I think grew like 25% or something, which is still great, but by comparison for you was relatively small. And then through the year, you were raising the biggest fund to date, and that was a slog throughout the year. Your second kid wasn't sleeping. We've got kids about the same age. We're about the same age, so I could so relate to that. And I think the end of 2023 post was the first one where it was like, oh, shit. Now what? So anyways, I felt like this was almost like perfectly timed because we get to reflect on what's happened so far and look forward, not from like the mountaintop, but from kind of this little pause where you called it consolidation. And so I wanted to start with maybe if you were writing a deep dive on Not Boring today. So like imagining taking a step out of your company and now you're researching and writing on it. I wonder what some of your hypotheses might be about what's been happening at Not Boring over the past year and kind of where it might go in the year ahead. And let me just add like the couple of things you've already said, because I don't want to just repeat what you've said. You said, all right, Maya was born not sleeping well. Fundraising was harder than it was in the past. That's a market-wide thing. More competition from people writing about startups, which is like, yeah, I think you created a model that people wanted to follow because it's awesome. And then 4 is like, you're the incumbent now. You've been around a while. You've got all of this background that you didn't have before that's showing up in the writing. And maybe you're a little bit less wild or futuristic in what you're exploring. So, okay. So from today, a couple months later after this article about 2023, what do you see? What would you be writing about if you were doing a deep dive on the company?
That is all so good. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Because if I were writing about a company, like and a company complained about like, oh, I'm the incumbent now. And so like other people are like, I'd be like, well, your model is too easily copyable then, or you're not being differentiated enough. And so to me, that's really like the big thing is like, how do you continue to differentiate? I think it's amazing that more people are writing about startups now, that more people are writing about weird startups and hard startups and are optimistic about the future. Like that is why we write the weekly dose of optimism. That's why I write these optimistic stories, because I think it's a really good thing for the world if the kind of things that people are reading transition from being like, this tech company did this stupid thing again to, can you believe that a group of 22-year-olds like in a little office somewhere in an apartment are pulling off this amazing thing that like big companies can't pull off? So like all of that is great. I think that I'm in a space like obviously that is not winner take all. And so I think like the big takeaway for me, and like if I were doing the deep dive from the outside, is how do you, one, get better at the thing that you already do? So like, how do I analyze complex businesses and take weird ideas seriously and go really, really deep? Like maybe get weirder and more out there on the ideas and better at the like underlying business strategy and business model stuff, and work harder to combine those two things. I think that's a really big one. How do I bring more smart people into my orbit so I can actually like kind of deal with a bunch of those ideas in the kind of like, research heavy manner that they deserve, and like with the insight that they deserve. And another is like really not caring about growth. Like, I think there's probably some cope in there where I'm like, growth doesn't matter. Like but really like if Not Boring were a fifth of the size, I'd actually rather just get like re-engagement from the really smart people that read Not Boring versus growing it. I'd much rather have, a core of 10,000 people who like religiously read Not Boring and feel that they get something new out of it each and every time that they read it, versus 200,000, 500,000, 2 million people who come to it for some like kind of platitudes on how to build a startup. Because I do think like most of that stuff ends up being kind of bullshit. And by the time you can like write down, like, here are the 10 things that you need to do to grow a startup, like that advice is done. Like you shouldn't be doing that anymore. And if you are reading that and putting that to work and building your startup, like you're probably in trouble. And so I think it's getting more differentiated, trying to find just like weirder stuff and just like put different ideas in people's heads so that they can come to their own conclusions, as opposed to pandering to the lowest common denominator, and like really trying to write for, I guess, myself, but then an audience of people who I really respect and want to at least like have a 1% impact on the way that they think about things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love the idea of just the quality of the audience. You have really high quality audience. I interviewed Sophie Purdom from one of the co-founders of Climate Tech VC as part of the show. And she said a similar thing, that if the right people are reading, the quantity may not matter as much. Because if you've got all the best people, the top founders, the people that are going to be the top founders who you might fund in the future, other venture capitalists, like there's a core group of people that if they're reading, then yeah, you may not need 1.5 million people reading for it to be a long game for you. But it's still hard psychologically when you've been growing like you have for it to then change. The game changed, basically. I mean, that's part of what I hear you saying is you can play a different game now because there's already 200,000 people reading what you're doing.
Totally. And I think that's why I kind of call it consolidation, and why I think the pause is probably a good thing. Because if it was just like continued growth and I needed to like get more sensationalist or more dumbed down or something to like keep that going, when you're in it, you kind of want to just keep doing whatever it takes to grow. When there's a pause, you kind of realize that the growth doesn't really actually matter that much. And like, it gives you time to think about what you want the thing to be for. And if I can, again, have like the tiniest influence on someone who's doing something really, really big, I'd much rather that than give lessons to the next million drop shippers or something. Yeah. They can all copy.
One of the things that I was reflecting on was how, you're pretty hard on yourself about the quality of the writing, and you reflected on that some, that like maybe you've fallen off a little bit, or it's like coming from a different place than it was originally. I can't help but like, so I've been an operator, I'm now a coach. I can't help but putting those hats on when I'm reading this kind of thing. And one of the things I was looking at is just how much more stuff your brain is divided across now. I mean, you've got 2 kids you didn't have when you started, hundreds of founders in your portfolio. You were raising a new fund this year. You made a narrative podcast, which we'll get into at some point because I've done plenty of podcasts over the years. you've hired a team. It used to just be writing and sponsorships. That was the whole game. And so part of me wondered if maybe it's not writing quality, if it's just the business has grown and gotten a lot more complex and you've got attention across a lot more things. And audience growth used to be the number one thing for you. You spent a lot more time on it. I wonder how that lands for you. And if maybe it's not so much writing quality and it's just a lot more stuff going on.
I've definitely written in the past, like, if it gets to a spot where I'm like outsourcing things to people and I'm just giving you content to give you content and we're doing more things, like I failed because the writing is the most important thing and everything else stems from the writing. So I do those other things because like I didn't think that investing was going to be a part of this kind of when I started it, but pretty quickly I realized that the two go together really well. And after being an operator for a while, I really didn't like the model of sitting on the sidelines and being like, well, that's stupid that company's doing that. Or like, that's kind of cool. Like I wanted to be able to express a view and get skin in the game and help founders and do all of that. The narrative podcast is like, something I view as kind of like the same general itch that I'm trying to scratch with Not Boring, explaining a complex thing simply. But there are some industries and some topics that take more than I can do in an essay. And if I just wrote about nuclear energy and fusion for 2 months, that might get pretty repetitive and slow. And I'm not the expert, like by any stretch of the imagination. So I wanted a chance to get to meet a bunch of people who really knew what they were talking about. So I think all of these things are kind of in service of the same goal, but you're right. Like versus when I was sitting in my in-laws' basement and like all I had to do 7 days a week during COVID was wake up, go to the basement, read the weirdest parts of the internet, like find a little hook and then like research that hook as much as humanly possible. Like certainly there is definitely, not the same amount of attention that I'm able to give each piece. And I think that's important because, there are some people who I think are like just incredibly like smart and insightful and like what you're paying for is like kind of their brain power and like their ability to analyze things and see them differently. I think kind of what you were getting at Not Boring was like really like just smart enough to like kind of understand things, but like not smart enough to take it for granted. And so like you're almost like paying with your attention, paying me to go out and just do like all of the research and try to connect the dots. And then, once I couldn't just spend 60 hours a week researching whatever I was writing about, then maybe there's a little bit of suffering there. I think on the flip side though, like I think I have developed an ability to put together different pieces in a different way than I could have before. I'm like seeing connections in different areas that I wouldn't have seen before. Maybe I can get some, good insights without banging my head against the wall for dozens and dozens of hours. So like, I think there are pluses and minuses, but I think again, the game has maybe changed a little bit where it really was just like, all right, pick a topic and I'm going to go research the hell out of it because I have a bunch of free time. And so why not?
Yeah. I mean, even I just think about so much from when you started, the place in the pandemic, being in lockdown, kind of moving into your in-laws' house from the city for a while, not having kids yet, or just having your first kid. It's just a lot of life change in there that alters what's possible.
And it's all the best too, right? Like it makes me so happy to like be able to do the Fusion podcast and then like tell my 3-year-old son about it. Or yesterday, he like literally out of the blue, we were just sitting around watching TV or his grandparents were here. And he's like, I want to record a podcast on liquid solids and gases. And so I just like set him up and that is so much better and like makes me so much happier. Not the podcast part. Like I doubt there will be podcasts by the time he's like, my age for sure. But just the idea that he like wanted to do what I did and like, go take an idea and like just talk about it for a while and then could literally sit in front of the mic for half an hour and just ramble. I don't think I need to figure out how to edit it and get it out there because it's hilarious. He made me leave the room and just sat here and talked. But like that is more rewarding and better in like a non-cheesy way than like anything else that I do. But I think like, again, how do you integrate that where like I have kids and like that means that there's less time, but like also it makes the futuristic technologies that we're writing about hit home more closely because it's stuff that like they'll actually get to experience and like on the bio side, stuff that hopefully lets me live with them for, a lot longer at a lot healthier level. And so I think there's just these trade-offs that you need to kind of like integrate and readjust to over time, but it's all good stuff. It's just like a matter of, just figuring out when you're in that transition and when you need to change things up a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So my I don't know how old your kids are. Mine are 4 and almost 2. My 4-year-old, he always wants to climb up on my seat in the office and sit here in front of the mic. And he calls it flying an airplane, but sometimes he'll knock on the door. He's like, Dada, are you podcasting? And it's just funny to think that that's the world they grow up in. So I have 2 boys. Having those kids I've always been very mission driven, very optimistic. It's part of what draws me to your work and why I wanted to have this conversation. But having kids made me take the future that much more seriously. It's like there's stakes, there's bigger stakes now, even beyond just my own desire for a better future. And I wondered how that's shaped your thinking becoming a dad and how it's altered your thinking about the future to have those two in tow and to be thinking about their lives going forward.
Yeah, I think it just gives me like a different, maybe time scale, but like even just a different time frame to think in, where I'm like, just picturing them at my age and what the world is going to be like, given what it was like when I was their age and what it's like now, and then how much faster things are accelerating, and just trying to think about the things that they'll take for granted that I think are just like these amazing futuristic things now that are going to be like, not even take for granted, but like boring and old technology by the time that they're our age. I try to do this with sci-fi a little bit too. It wasn't intentional, but I just like reading sci-fi. And then this kind of happens where like, if you spend enough time kind of like in the shoes of the future, and then you look back at now, you're like, oh yeah, like of course we're trying to do fusion, or of course, we're doing genetic engineering, or, CRISPR. Yeah. I didn't know it was going to be CRISPR, but like, obviously we were going to mess with our DNA. And so I think like trying to like really spend time in the world of the future a little bit and then look back, it like lets you take, weird ideas more seriously now, because a bunch of them are going to come true and seem mundane.
Yeah. The kid thing, it's a mind blower. We can come back to them in a minute. One of the other things I was thinking about in this journey for you and kind of where you've ended up right now and where you're going from here. So just to put it in context real quick. So you were at a startup called Breather for a while and really helped scale that out. You had a bunch of people reporting to you. We had similar kind of like lead ups to departures from two different startups that we were at. So I want to talk about that at some point. But you left that startup. You had this new idea that was going to be an in-person social club for a while. That was leading up to the pandemic. You had like gotten all hyped on it, convinced yourself that it was going to be great. And the pandemic kind of forced you to shut it down. And you look back gratefully on that because you realize like, oh, there were some flaws in that business model, maybe that I wasn't seeing from inside of it. And so the pandemic hits, you're on the back end of a failed idea and that it wasn't what you were going to be doing. You didn't have an income and you're starting this blog basically, and you're going to have your first kid. So that's what was going on at the time. And so you write a lot about, I thought about calling this episode Fear and Optimism because my interpretation of that from my seat, and I might be projecting, is like there were some fear drivers there of I got to make this work somehow. And so I wonder if that was true. Like, did you feel a sense of this has to work at all?
I mean, like certainly I wanted it to work, but what I thought working was going to be was someone would read it and I'd get a cooler job than I would have gotten otherwise. I don't feel a lot of fear. Like, I think that the optimism thing, like, for better or worse, like I think that everybody has their double-edged sword. Like if you're a character in a book, everybody has that double-edged sword, or like the thing that is their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. And mine genuinely, I think, is optimism. It lets me be like pretty dumb and just like, I don't know, like let's go write a newsletter and like do a blog for free for a while and see what happens. And I'm sure something good will come out of it. So, I do think it is a blessing and a curse, but I don't think there was a ton of fear there. It was just more like, I think it's an objectively kind of from the outside scary situation, but I think there's a lot of like, I grew up upper middle class, like I never had to worry about, like where our next meal was going to come from. I like had this thing that happened a bunch of times where I'd not get something the first time and then I'd end up getting it the second time. Like I wouldn't get elected to, we had something called the vestry, which was like our chapel council in high school. That it was less religious than it sounds. We got a bunch of speakers to come in. It was like this great thing. And I like didn't make it. And then I, got elected to that the following year. Or in college, there was this group, awful name, but Dukes and Duchesses, which was essentially like the ambassadors for the president's office. And it was like this really, really hard thing to get into. But again, you'd like organize all these great events and you get to work at things when like all of the special guests or the board of trustees or whatever came into Duke, and just got like straight up rejected on like I think they asked me in my interview the first time I applied if I could have dinner with one or a conversation with one living person, like who would it be? And this was back in 2006 or 7. And I was like, Osama bin Laden's worldview is like very different from my own. So I think that'd be kind of interesting. They were like, the hell? Like you can't say that in front of a board of trustee member for sure. So I got rejected and then ended up becoming the president of that organization. Like, so things just like kind of have worked out. Like, it's not like I'm, curing cancer or anything. It's not like these like great things, but there's just been like enough reinforcement that like things will be fine, that I don't think there's a ton of fear there as much as there just is like, yeah, this is a weird circumstance that, 30, whatever, to find myself in after like a good education and good jobs and whatever. And now I'm in my in-laws basement writing a newsletter, but never was there like oh man, I'm like totally going to fail here.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. So it's also interesting to think about, you went from, let's call it opportunistic then, this kind of opportunistic take on, I'm going to write, you were taking a writing course from David Perel at the time, very well known for his Rite of Passage course now. Also a great podcast if you haven't listened to that.
I just did my interview for it.
Oh, nice.
When that comes out. Yeah.
So you've got this opportunistic take. You're kind of like an underdog though. At best you're thinking, I'm going to go find a job. And it turns out, obviously that's not what happened. Like it grew into this massive thing that's now your job. I was thinking about this in turn. So I went to the University of Georgia growing up, or in college rather. And so I'm a college football fan. And there was like my whole life that we were hoping to break through back to the Herschel Walker years and win a national championship and like get back on top. So forever, the expectation is we're going to lose, but hey, there's upside if we make. That would be like awesome. It's enough reason to root. And then we finally break through a few years back and we overcome the big bad villain of Nick Saban in Alabama and we win a national championship. And then we win another one. And now it's like we just expect it every year. We should win every year. And there's such a massive change in psychology in that. And I was kind of mapping that by analogy onto your story as well from the outside looking in, that you were basically all upside for a long time. And now you've got a lot more to lose. Like one way to look at it is in 2021, you tweeted, I hope I do $1 million in revenue this year, because why not? And then you did. And now you've got an even bigger thing going on with the fund and the audience and everything else. And I wonder how the psychology's changed for you of like going from being an underdog with nothing but upside to now maybe there being more pressure or expectation on you to like keep delivering.
Totally. I mean, this is such a good one. I also grew up in a similar sports situation. I was a Philly sports fan. So Eagles certainly in that same boat. Like the Sixers, my favorite part of the Sixers season every year was the draft. Like I was a Sixers fan in the middle of the process. The season was terrible, but then like the draft lottery would come, we'd get a good pick, and then we'd pick somebody or do something really dumb and trade up to get Markelle Fultz and give up Jason Tatum and draft picks and whatever. But like that expectation that like something might be better in the future was like, yeah, maybe that's why I am the way I am, is because of my Philadelphia sports fandom. And then you get there and you're like, damn, the Eagles were just like really bad this year. How did we only how did we make the playoffs but just get our clocks clean? I still don't understand how it was a weird season for the Eagles this year. That like certainly resonates. In high school, I was, like the up and coming, I was a fat kid in middle school and then somehow just became a good runner and was like, I like shocked the team when I came in freshman year, and then was like the like young, like gunner kind of just winning races that I shouldn't have been winning and whatever coming up. And then I was the captain senior year and I was like the best runner on the team. And there were other young gunners kind of coming after me. And like the first half of the year, I got my ass kicked by like people that shouldn't have been beating me. And I was like, what is going on here? I remember one race in particular, like we were at Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. And after the race, I just like took my spikes off and like threw them at the batting cage. Was so pissed off. Ended up coming back and breaking course record on our big rivalry day and like ended the year well. But like definitely like that same thing where it's like, it's way more fun to be the underdog and kind of come from behind and surprise people. And I think there's definitely something to that idea for not boring as well. Again, I don't view it as much as like, we have a business to protect or like something to lose there, as much as like there definitely is maybe a little bit of like writing scared is too strong a word, but like I could write the dumbest stuff in the beginning and like nobody would care. Like I wrote a piece called like entropy theory and I don't know anything about physics and like my definition of entropy was a little wrong. And like even naming something entropy theory was like conceited, but I was like, well, no one really reads this anyway. So like, I'm going to go with this. And now like, I just think about like get ahead and like put myself in the shoes of the people who are going to dunk before they do it. And then I change the way that I write because of it. And that kind of happens. Like I wrote a piece this year called The Techno-Industrial Revolution that was like almost intentionally like a bombastic name for something that like people just saw it like deep tech. But like we're calling it the techno-industrial revolution almost to like force myself back into like making those like bolder kind of more grandiose claims and just like not giving a shit. Because when you get dunked on enough at some point, like it just like you realize it like really doesn't matter. And the good stuff is what matters. And so just trying to get back to like really not caring. Like I spent Christmas break just like reading about UFOs and like, UAPs, and I like just forcing myself to like really think about weirder ideas and how it could apply. And like, I want to just like keep doing that, create more free time to read about weird stuff and think about weird stuff and try to come up with crazy ideas. Cause like, if I'm writing a really good analysis of a public SaaS company, like, one, who cares? And two, there's going to be people out there who do it better than I do, but like maybe I can find the combination of weird ideas that nobody else has found. And like that might really add something to the people who read it. And so I'd rather just like make a fool of myself to put something out there that could be valuable as opposed to playing scared.
Yeah. And I mean, three, on, even if you try and write safe stuff, you're still going to get dunked on, for completely different reasons. And so there almost comes this point where there's like this exit velocity to what you're writing where it's no longer given. I think you said this in one of your essays, you're no longer given the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
Because it's going beyond people who know you, who know your intent, your heart, like the purpose behind it. And it's just reaching randos on Twitter or whatever. And they're coming back with their hot takes on how stupid you are. And that could be no matter what you publish with a large enough audience. One of my other friends who was on the show, James Clear, he sold the most books on all of Amazon last year. And he's now reached the point where like he writes pretty innocuous, like good stuff that's applicable to most people. Speaking of like what it takes to get to 3 million email subscribers or whatever, he's basically applicable to everyone. And now he's getting dunked on because people are just tired of hearing about him. Yeah. And he basically is like as kind as they come. So it just is going to happen. And you've got this quote from back in May 2021. It says, "The only things I'm not optimistic about are cynics and, well, actually, people. It's easy to dunk. It's easy to look smart saying why things aren't going to work, but those people are not our people." And that just hits right at home on this conversation. It's like, I've got the man in the arena quote over here. If I could adjust one thing, it would just be like the human in the arena. But I love it so much because it's just way easier to be a critic. You get to read someone else's smart thing and then come up with a reason why it might be stupid. Congratulations. But I love hearing from you that like, I think there's this exercise that you have to go through of not letting yourself get put in a box by that. And that's what I'm hearing you say is like, you're working on not letting yourself get put in a box.
And there's another piece of it too, though, which is even with weird ideas or like putting yourself out there, like being really serious and thoughtful about the analysis so that like, even if it turns out to be wrong, you can be fine with the way that you thought about it. Or if it turns out to be right, you can be right for the right reasons or whatever. Like I think one of the more fun things that's happened recently from like just a Schadenfreude perspective is crypto coming back, and like specifically Solana. I got dunked on for writing a Solana piece. Like I had a couple people being like, "When are you going to apologize for writing about Solana?" And like, I reread the piece multiple times to try to find if there were things in there that, like I said, that were too bombastic or that were like, like this is going to be the next $1 billion whatever. And it wasn't. There was like a long bear case section. There was here's what I think is interesting. I don't think it's an ETH killer, but it's trying to win on this particular thing for these use cases. And like, that's kind of come true. Like Axie is another one that I like really got dunked on for. And I definitely got a little excited on that one because like I'd never seen numbers like it. But they've like gone into the hole during the bear market and they built their Ronin chain into like maybe the leading kind of gaming L2 out there. And they're like really putting up numbers right now with other games beside Axie on their chain. So like they're doing really well. And so it's fun to see like from a Schadenfreude perspective for me, but also just like incredibly impressed that those people have been able to just kind of keep building and like get through to the other side. It's fun to see that like even if the cynics are right in the short term, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, if you like are thoughtful enough about like the inputs to your thinking, nothing really changed for me during the bear market in crypto because like the thing I cared about wasn't necessarily the price. It was like some of the things that I saw like might start coming together. That's been cool to see that like, at least it's not complete. I wasn't like completely wrong on all of that. And now we're starting to see, I think, more and more interesting things starting to compound on each other in crypto. I think that's just like the most tangible example for me right now of like, you can be right-ish in the long term, like even if the short term it looks dumb.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It brings to mind a couple of things for me. The first one is just having strong ideas rooted in sound principles that even if the predictions end up wrong, that you can still be doing quality thinking about what might end up true along the way. And then the other one is that so much of business is just staying in the game long enough to win. for a lot of these technologies, the game is going to be, can they stay alive long enough to win? You could say that's the story of solar on some level. It's like solar had to stay in the game long enough to become the cheapest energy source right now. If it hadn't, we would be having a different conversation about what technologies are available right now. So it's so applicable in so many different ways.
And solar's such an interesting one because in a couple of different ways. One, I think there is like very much, the Midwit curve is like a really just like genius, insightful thing. And like being on the left side of it, where it's just like curve goes down. It's like a valuable thing to just kind of trust that like when an exponential curve is happening, that unless there's, a real reason that it might not keep happening. And even then might like the curve might still actually just overwhelm that. Just kind of like dumbly extrapolating some of those things is interesting. And I think solar is like the prime example of that, where every year the experts are wrong about what's going to happen to solar, and it just keeps getting cheaper and there keeps getting more, becoming more solar installation. The second one is like, now that it's becoming clear that solar is a thing, the like ecosystem of things springing up around solar, whether that's battery development, whether that's figuring out ways to get increased capacity on existing solar. Like there's this economy of things that now support solar that are springing up on top of it that then lock it in once it like looks like the obvious thing. And it's cool to see like some of that really starting to happen.
Right. And now, just take that another step further, all the arguments are against storage being possible. Another guest on the show, it's like I'm now getting to the point on the show where I can start doing what you do with all your posts. It's like in this other post that I had, Hannah Ritchie came on, who's the deputy editor at Our World in Data. Her new book is great, but in it, she does kind of like the math breakdown on mineral requirements for the new energy economy versus the oil and gas economy. And basically just debunks the whole idea that it's like extravagantly more minerals in this new economy with batteries and storage and everything else. She's like, no, actually, there's going to be less mining required, and there's a longer time horizon that we can use the minerals on. And if we can design for recyclability, it's a never-ending source. You get into like the fundamentals and the first principles on this stuff, and it's like, oh, so we're just having another debate about the same exact curve at a different point in.
Yep. Yeah, that's amazing. And the other thing that I've loved about kind of just energy generally is like every time we're like, oh, we're going to run out of resources, you figure out like, oh, we just found like the largest lithium deposit in the world right in California. Like we need to figure out how to refine it and all sorts of stuff. But like when there's an economic incentive, people figure things out. I've read Robert Zubrin's The Case for Nukes. He also wrote the Case for Space and The Case for Mars. And The Case for Nukes is awesome because he's like, there really is like no such thing as like a natural resource or raw material. Like the earth like tries to kill you. It's like this like horribly inhospitable place. And then humans figure out how to like pull things from the ground and do things to it to refine it and turn it into something. And at some point we'll figure out fusion and we'll be able to just like shoot a plasma gun at all the materials that we've used and recycle them down into their, component parts and start again. And so like, we really have this abundance of resources. And then when we run into those, we go to other planets because we have fusion. That becomes easier. Maybe we figure out anti-gravity or whatever. Like you just don't really run out of resources when there's enough incentive to find more and figure out new ways to get more out of them. And so it's just like a very fun kind of thing to watch happen, that we're like every problem that people present, you look back like a decade on like why this is going to fail. Like, oh, we're going to run out of oil. Oh, we figured out oil and gas. Like we figured out fracking. Like that's amazing. All of these different challenges, people just kind of like keep figuring out solutions to. And at some point you just got to be like, I don't know, again, like left curve it and be like, I don't know how we're going to figure this one out, but like, it seems like we're probably going to figure this one out.
Yeah. It's a pretty good bet if we rely on history. Okay. I wanted to do one more thing on kind of the current moment. And you might not remember this, but you did a couple of podcast episodes back in 2021 on Acquired and then the Flywheel podcast. And I can't remember which one it was, but you had this quote where you said, yeah, at some point, the tech and investing market is going to take a downturn, and I'm going to be the guy obnoxiously making the bull case, the optimistic case for years on end while the market is shit, essentially. And I would imagine that period of time is going to be a little bit of a slog for me.
I didn't remember that. That's amazing.
I'll have to go back and find the exact quotes that I can send it to you after the fact. But here we are. You're basically in that moment of the downturn, making the upside case for a lot of different technologies at a time when I would say investors are behaving more fearful than ever, sitting on massive piles of dry powder and not deploying it right now. We've got all these amazing technologies and kind of like the valley of death for funding. And you're the one making the optimistic case. So, your prediction came true. And I just wonder what it feels like to be in this moment.
That is a very funny way to put it. Like, I think, again, with like blessings and curses on the optimism thing, like I think I'm probably really good at buying when everybody's scared, and then really bad at selling when everybody's a little bit overexcited. But my best performing, like I use Composer for investing, and I can create these symphonies, like these different strategies. And my best performing strategy is one called Unloved Tech that I like. And it's up 3x because I just bought a bunch of stuff that I thought was oversold, like at the bottom of the market. I bought TQQQ is like my biggest holding now, the triple leveraged NASDAQ that I bought when NASDAQ was tanking. And that's like killed it for me. Like, so I'm like this dumb and optimistic all of the time. And like, if the long-term trends change, I'm in like real trouble. But like I was kind of waiting for a moment like that to be able to deploy, like when people were fearful. At the same time, that's why the fundraising thing has been so frustrating, because I was like, no, I'm like, this is my moment. Like I should be like, this is the time where I can like really find some like great stuff when prices aren't quite as crazy and competition's not quite as crazy. But overall, I feel very happy to have had the opportunity to kind of keep being optimistic and not just have it be like a yelling another bullish voice when everybody's bullish kind of thing. Yeah. But that's an amazing find. I completely forgot about saying that.
Yeah. I think I was sitting like, I don't know. I listened to your voice nonstop for the past 2 weeks, so I don't know what I was saying. But anyways, I was sitting there and I wrote that one down because I was like, this is perfect for right now. That also brings to mind what you just said in reflecting on last year. You were talking about wishing you had run a tighter process on the fund and getting that money in because you had to pass on opportunities that you had high conviction on. And so I wonder what that emotion's been like having access to these deals that you would be in on if you had the fund closed. Like, how have you dealt with that? And what's been your reflection process as you've gone through some of those missed opportunities?
Yeah, that's just been brutal. It hasn't been end of the world brutal. It's a great, like, I'm privileged to like even be able to have fundraising conversations and like all of that. But I think like this is the other side of the double-edged sword optimism thing where I was like, oh yeah, fundraising markets are tight, but like, I don't know. I really like the last two fundraising processes. I'm sure this one won't be bad. I'll just like go out and talk to people and it'll go great. And so I didn't treat it with the seriousness that the process deserved to be treated with, kind of in any market, but particularly in this market. Now, I could have been 10 times more serious and it was a tough one. And so maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. But certainly like being able to like publicly point to my views on certain things and like write them down. And so far, I think they've turned out decently well, a combination of like that things will be fine, but also this shift to harder companies and all of that type of stuff. I think generally the thesis was kind of right, but like having the thesis written down is worth like practically nothing if you can't actually deploy capital against it. And so it made me think of this as more of a business, which I think is another one of those things where long term, it's going to be really, really healthy that I had this experience. Short term, it's incredibly frustrating to like kind of feel that the thesis was right, but not be able to put everything that I have behind the thesis.
Yeah. So you've kind of highlighted like almost like the clichéness of you having raised at the peak and then going through this trough and, like all of that. But I wonder if there's anything that you're willing to share publicly, reflecting back practically that you would have done differently to alter that.
There's definitely a bit of an idealistic streak in me. And so I was like, you know what? Like, I don't need institutional LPs. And like, I really would love for this to be a thing where it's just like, if I'm going to be writing about these companies in the newsletter, then like the people who invest with me should be people who read the newsletter. So I'm not just like jamming a bunch of companies down their throats. And like, it could be this thing where we just like really have this like almost community type movement around a fund. Where I think, the value of an institutional LP shows itself when they're set up to kind of deploy through every market. That said, there's plenty of institutional LPs who pulled back, were over allocated, their public books got marked when their private books hadn't. And so like they weren't necessarily deploying either. But I think building those relationships ahead of time and frankly, just learning about what it takes to run a fund, I think all of that would be something that I would go back and do differently. At the same time, like, I don't want to overly change myself. Like, I don't know if I've said this one out loud yet, or certainly haven't written about it because it's like not the thing you're supposed to say while you're funding. I also think there's a lot of like what I call like venture theater that people put themselves through to raise funds or like whatever, where they're like, oh yeah, like here's my detailed portfolio construction model, where like the thing that matters is that you get a 100x or 500x or 1000x company, and like really, really, really caring it. There are specific strategies where it like really makes sense to care about like entry valuation. You can be really tight on that and then really tight on your follow-ons. And that is just very clearly not my strategy. So for me to have to be like, yeah, like, so the way that I think about entry valuation is like, if it's anything over a 10 million posts, like I'm not like, I just like, I think if there, again, like if there are rules in a playbook that you can follow, like you're probably late on that thing. And I think entry price in venture like is really one of those things that annoys me, because it's one of those things that like you can really sound sophisticated being like, oh, people got really, really crazy on valuation and blah, 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 blah. For like, I don't know, Facebook at 100 million seemed like a crazy investment. And it ended up being one of the greatest investments in the history of the world. And I think that's true for a lot of good companies. I think the market's gotten a lot better at recognizing which founders have the right kind of combination of talent for the thing that they're trying to do and team building ability and whatever. You need to be looking at something like really, really crazy that you have specific knowledge on to, I think, find something that's going to be really big at a cheap price. And that's maybe just like one example, I think, of this like venture theater idea where people like really major in the minors and like focus on like these detailed things that they know LPs want to hear. Where like, I think I'm just like really not good at playing that part of the game.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, just watching you from the outside, I don't even think you could win at that version of the game. It's like, why would you try and play that version? You know, you're not a quant sitting at a computer, like running models on these undiscovered opportunities. And you have great deal flow. You have a massive community. You have great reputation. It's like, yeah, I'm going to deploy into the companies that look like they might win at a high return if they do. And if not, I'm just going to take big swings on founders taking big swings and like, let's go.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me.
I mean, if we're getting heretical here, like another weird view, and this, maybe I get canceled for this one. I haven't looked into the tax implications of this. So like,
this is not investing advice. Yeah.
Not investing advice or financial advice, but like, I think that if a lot of the money that went into charity went into venture, like went into like real venture funds, like not, like not things that are chasing the nth version of a particular type of product, but like real venture funds, like that's a better use of dollars for society than putting that money into charity. And so like, I think you generate the best returns this way as well. And like all of that, like I think you can build a really good fund. But yeah, there's like a little bit of, I think you should just be going after a bunch of these founders who can like really, I think we like live in this moment where you can make a huge impact on the world and build really, really big companies at the same time. And I'd rather be backing the people who are going for something like that.
Yeah. That's interesting. It sparks kind of like this mental model for me where I think in 3 buckets for just like, if we were reallocating charity dollars as they exist today. So one is like big bets on founders taking big swings on really hard problems that could be profitable long-term. The second bucket would be like the effective altruist giving bucket down here. That's like proven strategies that we know work, that we need to deploy at scale and get it across the world. Malaria nets, deworming meds, stuff like that. Malaria vaccines, now that we've got those, like that kind of thing. So the third one would be following the Collison brothers approach, where they said research is broken. It's not that charity dollars shouldn't be going to it. It's that we need to reinvent the fundamental models and like structures that we're working within. And so let's go deploy into a new entity whose goal is to solve the problems as fast as possible with R&D processes that reflect for-profit processes, rather than deploying into institutions that move too slow and don't actually try and solve the problem.
Yes.
So like those would be the 3 buckets I would deploy into. Big bets, for-profit, reinventing the like R&D and research to invent new solutions, and then deploying the stuff that we know works. It's not highly profitable, but that would transform the world if everyone had it. Like that would be an interesting structure.
And I think if you're a very large long-term fund that wants to be around for a while, I think there's an argument to be made that one of the better things that you can do with your management fee is that Collison bucket, where like you fund R&D, you have this pool of money that you know is coming in every year on $1 billion. That's $20 million a year guaranteed coming in for at least a decade. And then you continue to raise funds and add on top of that. I think in certain areas, VC might actually be the best industry to fund a lot of R&D, just because they're the ones who can capture the economic upside on the other side if it comes to fruition or if anything comes out of that. But which, if it's management fees and not returns driven, you're not saying like, we need this specific research to be done. Like you can afford basic science because you know that at some point in your fund's life, like that might come back to you and you've been this hero of the industry. I haven't thought through that one deeply enough, but I do think that VC management fees on a big fund are this like really interesting pot of money that could either just go to the partners' pockets or like actually are this pretty aligned funding mechanism for a bunch of really interesting, like world positive things.
No, it's super interesting to think about how we get more R&D happening, because one of the like downside cases long term would be that we are disincentivizing long-term R&D in a lot of companies to the point where it's becoming not profitable anymore to pursue it at the level that it's been pursued. And whether that's pharma or tech or pharmaceutical tech or whatever, if we disincentivize R&D out of the capital structure of these companies and it's not happening elsewhere, we pay that cost over the 50-year, 100-year time horizon. So that's an interesting problem worth thinking about.
I'm not going to be the one to solve this, and I'm not going to be the first person to say it, but there are like plenty of R&D dollars out in the world, and like, you know, plenty of universities are well funded on a bunch of stuff. And like, is it going to the best stuff? Almost certainly not. Like how you figure out how to get it to more productive stuff is a harder question that I don't have the answer to, but there's a lot of money out there. Hopefully, and I don't know what it takes to shake up the system, but you know, I think that is not an intractable problem to get those dollars into kind of weirder and more diverse ideas. I think like it seems that there's kind of an accepted set of things that you can research, and then there are things that like you really can or you're not going to be able to get funding for. There's, you know, I think the Fast Grants program, they surveyed the people involved, and it was like, if money was no object, or the question was something like this: if money was no object, would you be pursuing the research that you're currently pursuing? And like 80% of them said no. Or like, you know, if you weren't stuck in your current grant or with the grant writing process, it was something around kind of the funding mechanism. But like most of the smartest people in the world wouldn't be doing what they're doing with their lives if the funding structure were a little bit different. So that feels like a very, very worthy kind of problem to solve.
Yeah, if the talent already knows intellectually that they're working on the wrong problems, then we've got an incentive misalignment somewhere in the process. Oh man, that's good. One of us should write about that. Okay, so before we wrap up kind of this first half of the conversation, I wanted to transition from, we've kind of been like playing around with this current moment that you're in and like looking at it through different angles and playing with different ideas related to it. We've gone back some, we've gone forward some, but I wondered if we might kind of in this first half of the conversation by really getting out of the current moment and projecting way into the future, because that's actually where I think you're best. That's like where you really live. Except for I want to do it in thinking about not boring. So the downturn will end, obviously. Like we're in this weird situation anyways, where macroeconomic trends are generally positive, but the investing market,
highs.
it like makes no sense really from a fundamental standpoint. But anyways, here we are. Venture markets are going to be humming again. Tech is going to get much bigger, as you wrote your essay about. Our kids are going to be in their teens. Like let's say we're 10 or 11 years out in the future, 2035-ish. Your business will be 15 years old. We'll be in our mid 40s, kind of like true midlife or approaching new midlife for what lifespans are going to be. Knowing everything you know from this moment in time, what do you think Not Boring might become over that time period? Like if you project out to 2035, what do you think is possible?
Yeah, I've always said that like I'm not planning and I'm just kind of enjoying the moment. And I think maybe that's another shift from the whole kind of past year. Like I actually have a pretty clear view of what I would want that to look like. I think the fund and the newsletter, like people are always like, are you going to stop writing and focus on the fund, or stop the fund and focus again on writing? And I think the two of them just like can go together really, really, really well. Or what I'd love to have is like almost this like hybrid organization of people. Like right now we have a mini version of this where we have Elliot on the biotech side, Elliot Hirschberg getting his PhD in genomics at Stanford. He's our biotech guy. He also writes Sensory Biology, which is like my favorite biotech newsletter. I think he's a phenomenal investor. So people like that who can kind of write and invest and are like deeply technical in their categories, maybe even some like really good, if they still exist, investigative journalists, like really this kind of org that is hybrid writing / investing that kind of like both invest in the future and then explains what's going on. I'd probably add a research kind of arm of the organization to that, where like, even if it's a researcher in residence type program, where like, I just want young, smart people with the best possible ideas. And like, this is a way for them to get exposure and access to a bunch of people. But like, almost out there seeking the weirdest but potentially true and impactful ideas that they can possibly find, and some machine where we use that to either just kind of make sure that that stuff like gets its best shot of existing, or we invest in some stuff that comes out of it, or we just write about it. When you have the investing and the content, you can do an awful lot with weird ideas. So like, how do you build an engine that just like takes in the best and most credible weird ideas and then does a lot of different things with them and like hopefully helps make some of those things come true?
That's super cool. We talked a lot about flywheels when I was at a company called ConvertKit, and I think actually I might have been one of the earliest people to write about it right after Jim Collins came out with his little addendum to Good to Great, but I had no distribution, so it didn't matter. But it makes me think about really building a bigger flywheel for yourself with like a lot more input on interesting, weird, like ground level ideas that you really need expertise to understand their potential, and then bringing them into this whole vortex and the ecosystem that you've got of the writing, the deep dives, and the investing, and like all of that being able to be fueled by the sourcing of ideas based on science and research and all of that. That's super exciting. It's almost like a studio seeking the best and most interesting futuristic ideas.
Totally. And I think you can do it in a pretty, like before, I think I would have said like fully decentralized, where I just like ask the audience for the best ideas and then they send them. And like, I don't think that's quite it. But I think there's a hybrid between like having a bunch of employees and like having this almost like loose federation of people who are like, partially affiliated with Not Boring, partially like outdoing their own things, but all kind of working towards the same goal.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. All right. So I think we'll call it there for the first half. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about where your optimism comes from. I want to talk about Age of Miracles as a concept and a show. I've listened to almost all of it now and just interested to dive in there. So that'll be in part 2. We'll take a couple minute break first though. Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation. And while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about 2 things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com, and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you know you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator and growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. There's no sponsors for the show at the moment, so consider me your sponsor. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. I was thinking about this idea that playbooks are basically out of date immediately once they're written down. The second there's a playbook, it no longer works. Whenever someone said, it might have even been David Perel that was like, make yourself the whatever guy or the whatever gal in your Twitter profile, and then immediately once that advice is out there, it becomes cliche and old and it doesn't work anymore. So you followed a playbook to build what you've built. And this show is primarily for founders, but there's also other creators and stuff like that are coming up and will be listening. So your playbook won't work anymore because it's broken because other people are trying to copy it. So if you were starting now, trying to build an audience of, let's say the end goal was 200,000 people and some solid business model behind it, whether it was ad driven, subscription driven, investing, whatever, what would you be doing to get attention today if you were starting from zero?
I don't think I could do it. I think I got lucky with the timing and the type of content then. And I don't know if that lightning strikes twice. And I think like there's a very particular thing that I wanted to do, which is kind of like write about technology and startups and business in this more fun way. And like I did that thing and I had the right moment to do that thing. And so like how you do that again, I don't know. I think someone like Jason Carmen, who's doing the S3 series and doing videos on deep tech companies, is somebody who's definitely going to hit 200,000 subscribers on his YouTube at the very least. And so I think like applying a new medium and like really focusing in on a certain type of company and just frankly grinding his ass off like on the side, producing these amazing videos over the weekend. Like I think that's absolutely incredible. And so it'd be something like that where like he has experience and access from working inside one of these companies, a particular set of skills, which is that he's a good interviewer, he's good at video and he's good at editing, and he can like turn these like amazing things around and just produce them week after week after week. I think that relies very much on a particular set of both interests and skills. And so I think it's less about what the new playbook would be or like how I would do it, as opposed to finding that intersection of your particular interests and your particular skills and seeing if there's an opportunity out there to do it. And even if there's not an opportunity, like what is the thing that you would want to do? If the fund and the newsletter went away, I would still want to talk to founders and try to analyze their businesses and like try to find out like if there are commonalities among all of like the weird new things that are happening. And so I think it's like finding that thing for you that is at the intersection of your interests and your particular skills.
It will sound trite, of course, because it's like the whole ikigai thing. But I think if I look back at your story, I mean, that is the secret sauce. It's just like your business reflects you. You are uniquely weird in your uniquely weird ways. And that's what your business is. It's like the way you view the world embodied in essays, deep dives, a fund. And so in some ways, I think when people go out looking for a playbook, they're looking to shortcut that process of getting confident being uniquely weird in their own way. And to be fair, it took me forever. Like this show might be the most uniquely me thing I've ever done. I finally was just like, shit, I'm doing what I want. I'm going to interview the people that I want. I don't even know what the theme is. I'm going to just nerd out on them for 30 hours or whatever every time. It's completely unreasonable. I have no business model and they've been so much fun. It's just like, what a great conversation to talk about how to redeploy charitable capital in the first half of this that I could have never predicted. So I think that would be my advice too, is just like really, really lean in to being uniquely weird in your own way. And the other thing I would say beyond that is you and I both put our years in. I mean, we put our years in doing other stuff first. Totally. We built our chops. We understand how to operate. We worked a lot of long hours doing other things to learn what's necessary to then operate in this way. For you to be the kind of investor that you are and the kind of writer that you are, you had to do some other things first. And like, I needed to do that too. So that would be the other thing is like, hey, go take 7 or 8 years and do something else before you do this kind of thing. But no one wants to hear that either.
No one wants to hear that either. And I always wonder if I could have like, I remember having a conversation with my mom and her business partner about like what I like doing outside of work. And the answer was like nothing. I was like, what do you mean outside of work? I work 7 days a week. Like I don't have any other hobbies. And I was like, I need to figure out something else to do. That's like maybe part of the reason I wanted to start that social club. I wish like, what if I had just figured out that this is what I wanted to do a decade earlier? I don't know if it would have been the same thing. Maybe it would have been. I think, there's nothing more magical than when a 16-year-old can like really figure out what their life's work is and like direct all of their, I certainly would have studied a lot harder. I was really good at math in middle school and then I had a terrible math teacher. And so I just stopped being good at math in high school. I really wish I were better at math and particularly physics now. Like I think I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that I could do. I almost like just the philosophical side of physics that I just wish I understood all of that better. So like, had I known what I wanted to do when I was 16, maybe I could have planned and done something a little bit better. But I think you're probably right that there probably is just a bit of that funk. Like being in a startup for 6 years, it was really hard and also failed is like a unique experience that gives me more empathy for founders and people who are trying really hard things. Makes me see the importance as I'm investing in hard things of like hard isn't the only good attribute. Like it also has to make economic sense. And so like there are these things that you have to earn, I think. But I do wonder if there's a way to like get people, to like figuring out what they want to do in those years that their brain is just firing and they have like nothing but free time. I think, you look at like the EAC movement or a lot of what's going on in San Francisco, and it seems like a lot of 22-year-olds who like really know what they want to, or, at least like really feel like they know what they want to do in life and are willing to like commit kind of everything to making that happen. And so I don't know what the right answer is. It'll be interesting to watch that one.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly wouldn't prescribe it to anyone. If you think you can get there sooner, go for it. I think so much of it is about two things. One is experiencing hardship that forces you to learn the resilience required to overcome hard things. And then second would be just exposure to enough of the landscape in the world to really see the opportunities and to see the comparisons between things. There's this like earned expertise that is where historically, this is where like, Watson and other early general intelligence, like directional type stuff failed, was where there was all this pattern matching going on in brains that they couldn't figure out how to replicate. And so much of that is seeing enough cases to have the repertoire to say, oh, I know what this situation is like. But maybe as the world changes faster and faster, that matters less and less. And I think a lot about that for myself. It's like I was so clearly inclined towards science and engineering, and I studied accounting and finance in school. I went to the wrong university for what I was inclined towards. But I didn't have anyone to like be able to see that in me. And I didn't know because I didn't have enough exposure. So I think a lot about that now as a parent. For my boys, it's like I want to just reflect back to them what I'm seeing in them and show them pathways they could follow.
100% without influencing the direction. Like,
right, exactly.
I want my son and daughter to like study physics starting now because I wish that I had. It's like I have to be like, all right, I think like they seem interested in it right now. I don't know how much of that is my doing. They're also just probably never going to be world-class physicists because they have my brain, and like there's something really special in a world-class physicist's brain. But yeah, I think reflecting back what that seems to be for them is a really good way of putting it.
Yeah. So you've got this great article called Optimism, essay, I should call it, not article, but in it, there's this quote. It says, there's something deeply optimistic about entrepreneurship, the idea that it's possible to create things that have never existed and find a market for them. Science, too, is optimistic. To run experiments in order to better understand the universe assumes a belief that we can discover more than we already know and use it to improve the world. Number one, it just deeply resonated with me, but I think it's also kind of reflective of the thesis of this whole thing that you're doing. But I mean, the article was like an ode to your best quality, which is your optimism. And I've thought a lot about my own optimism over the years, just trying to understand like, where does that come from? And why is it that some people end up, cynical or pessimistic, and some people end up optimistic, sometimes maybe in response to like the same inputs or similar inputs early in life. I'm an optimist. Like I stay in hope and belief that the future will be better than the present. But I also get really grumpy and frustrated if progress doesn't happen fast, because it's like I want to see it come true. And so it's an interesting juxtaposition in my own life, like being hopeful about the future, but sometimes frustrated with the present. And I've thought about whether those two things are related. Is it like, is my optimism a way of coping with my present frustration? And here's where I've landed basically in all of this. I'll get to the question in just a second. Or I know that repressing my anger is like an old pattern in my life where I like try and repress things that make me angry. And then I end up like, I'm worse off for it basically because I'm the only one who ends up feeling it. It stays in my body. And as I've analyzed that, I realize that I actually get sad really easily. When I see things that are sad in the world, I respond by like masking it with anger and then repressing that and then like moving forward. And so I actually think that my optimism is a response to my sadness. It's if I'm sad in the present, but hopeful about the future, then it gives me something to look forward to. It gives me like hope that I won't always be sad because I see something better out there. We've already learned in this conversation that me projecting onto you is not accurate. So I'm curious about like, if you've thought, or if it even matters, like where your optimism comes from and where you think that was rooted in.
I feel like almost like I'm like half Irish, the embodiment of the departed, like, the Irish are impervious to psychoanalysis. Like, I don't think I get overly sad. I don't think I get overly angry. I don't even think it's like a response. Like, it's just something that's kind of always been a part of me. And I think like, again, fortunate that, things have generally gone right. And that like when I just can like be dumb and sit back and trust the process, like things end up being not the greatest in the world all the time, but like fine. And, you can take a risk on the newsletter and it ends up being fine. Or, you like all these things that like feel like really big things in the moment, no matter what you decide, like end up being kind of fine. I think my optimism is like almost this like, and I wouldn't have had words for it, but just like a dumb appreciation for complex adaptive systems that like there's all this stuff that happens and then like things typically end up fine and are like actually fine with an upward direction. And like it's almost as much like there's the optimism that I feel, but then even writing that essay, it almost felt like there was this weird disconnect between reality, which is like at least reality since the Industrial Revolution, and the way that people were talking about the world. And that just seemed like gross to me, actually. Like that, and you hate to blame business models. Like if I'm going to really be a true like free markets person, like the newspapers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing in response to that by calling out that we should be more optimistic and whatever. But it is gross that like there are people who are deciding not to have kids because people are telling them that the world is going to end and like all of that stuff. And so it almost seemed like just this like really clear mispricing that things were getting better and better and better. And people felt like they were getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And so like more just like almost like a fact-based calling attention to the fact that that's happening. I think in the beginning, it was just kind of like a natural thing that I did in pieces where like I tried to like find the bear case and I was just like, I don't know, I think this could all go like really, really well. And so like I recognized that and called myself out for it. I think as I've like more explicitly named the optimism and thought about it more often, it's probably like come to me a little bit more. I spend more time now like searching for stories and talking to my brother about doing the weekly dose of optimism. And so like feeding myself more of that stuff. But I think the biggest driver of it for me now is this like kind of early stage investing where people say like all this terrible stuff is happening. And then I'm talking to the entrepreneurs who like very clearly believe and are like willing to feed me the memo or the deck that they put together that distills like all of their life's knowledge into a few pages telling me why this thing that people think is insoluble is like a very tractable problem that they can figure out how to solve and do it economically and all of that, where that feels just like this hack on the future where I know that 80% of them are going to fail, 90% of them are going to fail. But like if 10% of the things that I see every day come true, things are really, really cool. And so I think it's like as much of just say like objective is probably too strong a word, but like just like trying to kind of look at the facts in front of me and be like, it seems like if you apply like a historical failure and success rate to this, and you take these crazy ideas that these people are working on and run it forward, things are going to be pretty good.
Yeah. And I think the more people engage with logic around it, hopefully the easier it should become to be hopeful. But it's certainly one of the points of this show is like, hey, there's a lot of good stuff happening. There's a lot of really smart people working in a lot of different fields, trying to make the world better, whether they're making poetry or whether they're making fusion reactors. There's a space for all of it. But if it's rooted in, we're going to make this thing better, that's positive. Like that is a good thing, number one. Number two, Hannah Ritchie, when she was on the show, there was this quote from her book that we talked about. And it was, she starts every chapter with basically like a negative headline from the press. And then in some of them, she would rewrite them. And so she's talking about extreme poverty in the world. She said, one headline we could write every day is 128,000 people or whatever it was were lifted out of extreme poverty yesterday. And we could write that every day, every day, every day, every day. And no one writes that story. It's like, why is that the case? Because that is what is true. That's what's actually happening. I think it's a product of our negativity bias, product of business models and sensationalism and all of that. But I do think there's a massive role to play in saying the stories that are negative that stick in our brains, that happens for like an evolutionary reason. It's good for us to survive if we let that stuff stick. It's like Packy died when he ate that red berry. Don't eat the red berry.
Yep.
That's basically its function. But when you look at data and cost curves on things like solar and other things like that, like we should expect things to get better and problems to get solved. And I'm preaching the choir, of course, because like I'm talking to, but I don't know, I get hyped about it because I think we need to talk about that more.
I agree. And I mean, there is some like, same as we talked about, like, things are going up with the newsletter. And so like, you just adapt to that. And if anything at all breaks that, you're like, whoa, what happened? Even if you're at like a higher absolute level. And there's something, I think, to the progress over the past couple of centuries that probably feels an awful lot the same, where you're just used to things kind of getting better, even if they feel day to day like they're not, where then a specific bad thing happens and you're like, oh my God, like this has to be the worst thing in the history of the world. And typically it's, probably not. I think there's also like very clearly some people are right now living like the worst moment of their life, or like are in a really rough patch where it really feels like things are much, much, much worse. And so it's like really easy to grab on to a headline and be like, yes, see, it's like not just me. Things are really, really bad in the world. I think that's like one, comforting and good, and like definitely have sympathy for that. And then two, I think bad that it probably like encourages a bit of complacency and like lack of agency, where it's like, oh, well, I don't know, everything's bad. So like, I guess, I'm stuck in this situation too. There's not an easy answer to this. And I don't want to be like super glib about it and just be like, everybody should just be like happy. We should all take Soma and we should all like, just feel good about the way that everything is. But I think like if you zoom out, at least like a lot of the one that really bugged me recently was people not having kids because of climate change, and like the number of headlines around that, like that kind of stuff really bothers me, because it feels like a problem that will be able to be solved, and that throwing more humans at will actually, be able to help solve that problem. But yeah, the facts, like I just really don't think match the headlines here. I saw the other day Business Insider, I guess they have a new editor in chief or somebody, a new president or something, and said like, we're for the optimists and we're whatever. And then like all they do is take down tech companies, take down leaders, talk about like the negative version of everything. And so like that stuff is very funny to me. And I think maybe like the starkest example of like, even when the people involved like really want that to be a thing, still the publication is just like oriented in such a way that if the negative headlines get clicks, they have to get the clicks. And so you have to figure out how to fight back against that. And I think I just finished a book that was written by like a really good journalist, and like the level of research and like traveling the globe to find different sources and trawling through all the primary source material and like all that stuff was like absolutely incredible. And like, I wish that we had that kind of journalism today. I don't see a ton of that kind of journalism. So like, I don't want journalism like of that kind to die, but like whatever is passing for journalism right now feels like a thing that is like probably ready to die, and like a new model comes and replaces it. And so we'll see where that ends up.
I think it's one of the reasons that people like Ezra Klein have stood out over time, is because they do such deep journalism and the quality of their work is so high relative to the expectation from other outlets that it's like, wow, that's pretty good. It's just an interesting trend. And I'll just acknowledge, like, look, for all of the people that will say a thing that I know is true, like there are so many people in the world who their current circumstances do not allow them to be optimistic about the future because they're just trying to make it. Also, none of the guests on the show, and probably like 99% of the people listening, if you're listening to this kind of conversation, that's probably not what you're going through. Now, I don't want to discount it if it is, like that's awesome if you're listening, but just I want to be real about who's part of this conversation. It's people who can think about building a better future from a basis of being relatively okay.
Yeah. I think that's actually a good general point too, where like, I think a lot of the people who are most vocally pessimistic about things are not people who like really have the real cause to be pessimistic about things. It's like overeducated people who can't find a job because they, did basket weaving to steal, I forget who, if it's Mark Anderson or somebody that calls it like the basket weaving major. And like, of course, then you're not going to find a job, but you've like paid all this money and you think you're special. And so like, then you're out like really yelling that the world is not fair and everything's going to hell in a handbasket and tech companies are ruining everything. But I think like the average person actually probably still does believe that like they have agency and they can control their own lives. And that is like way less dependent on socioeconomic status and more just like there's this one class of people with a very loud microphone who is telling people that things are bad.
Yeah. I want to transition a little bit because we could probably talk about this topic for hours, but I want to talk about the podcast. So I've made, I think, 5 podcasts over the years, and I've had the ambition to do narrative podcasts in the past, and I've even worked on them before. It is really hard.
Way harder than I thought.
Yeah, really, really hard. And I was really fascinated to see that was the approach that you took. So quick context, because I don't want to make you repeat the stuff that's already out there. Age of Miracles, it's a podcast. You're doing it in seasons, at least initially. The first season is on nuclear energy. You partnered up with Julia DeWall, who either has been or will be a guest on the show. I don't know when she'll be published relative to yours. She's a founder in the nuclear industry, working on bringing nuclear power to the Department of Defense. Background at Open Door, SpaceX, working on Starlink, like incredible human.
She's incredible.
The two of you doing that together was like, seems obvious. I want to get into that a little bit. And it's basically a season on all the background on nuclear, safety, what people think about, barriers to why we haven't deployed more, and then companies that are working on fixing them. Great show, really strong narrative perspective. I mean, it sounds like an NPR show. It's like This American Life applied to nuclear. It's pretty good.
Thank you.
And I know just like the amount of scripting and deep research and what gets cut and the recording and tone and everything. All of that to get to, looking back, did you know what you were getting into when you signed up for making a narrative show?
Not at all. I had the idea. I was like, oh, this is actually really cool. It's like something I'm not going to be able to do in the newsletter. I'd love to be able to like just talk to the smartest people that I can and like really work our way down from general industry people to investors to companies and even researchers who are working in the space. Like what a cool way to get a perspective and like a snapshot in time on these industries that I think are going to be important. We partnered with an awesome company, Turpentine, to produce it. And so I was like, so pretty much I just need to like show up. That is like normally how their podcasts work. Like they take a lot off your plate. They do all the editing, they do all the post-production, they help with scheduling, they do sponsorships. Like for their normal podcast, which is an interview podcast, it is like a no-brainer, like super easy thing for the host. For everybody involved, including their team, I think this is more than any of us realized we were signing up for. I also think that we had like a total blast doing it. But what I didn't appreciate is that it was just like writing a second essay every single week, but like a type of essay that I was less used to writing, where you just do a bunch of interviews and then you need to like form that into a narrative that is consistent with the kind of whole arc of the season, but also like responds to the things that people are saying. And so if I came in saying like nuclear is the best, and then everybody came on and was like nuclear is stupid, like you have to present that, and you can't just cherry pick the quotes that like perfectly fit your argument. So we did an episode with all the people who kind of represent the different energy technologies that they think are superior to nuclear. I think that was, one of the episodes that I think all of us were proudest of. Is we're talking about nuclear, but like I really hate and like maximalism of any type, but like energy maximalism seems so stupid. I want like more solar and more nuclear. I want us to figure out fusion. And if we can figure out like 0 point energy, like please, like I'd love to do, like the more energy, the better. And like, that's the goal, or the goal is the things that you can do when you have more clean energy. But yeah, writing a second script and then even recording, like the first few, we must've had like 4 or 5 recording sessions, like going back, listening to how horrible it was because the script wasn't very good. And then like, we didn't read it particularly well. And by the last couple, we were like really kind of humming and had it down. And I kind of knew how to write a script and it was working, but man, it took a while to figure out how to get that going. Yeah,
no, I'm so sure. I think, people who haven't made something like that just won't appreciate the level of complexity required to get there. So that's why I asked the question, just to highlight like how hard it is to get to the final product. So 2 questions about just kind of like the experience. One is, I'm assuming you and Julia knew each other before, but how did that conversation start? And like, how did you both come at it, and what made you end up wanting to work together and feeling like it was a good fit for both of you?
Yeah. So we had met before, but really like I reached out to Eric Tornberg, who runs Turpentine. And I was like, I have this idea for a show, one frontier industry at a time. Don't really know where we're starting. Definitely interested in energy. I think nuclear fission and fusion is like a really good place to start, even though I don't know if it's investable for me or whatever, but I think it's like a really good base to start at. Through a couple of different categories out there. One was like biotech, and not being a podcast person, they were like, what do you mean biotech? Like that is way too big to like, do you want to do longevity? Do you want to do cell manufacturing? Like what specific thing do you want to do? Because just doing biotech is going to be this big unwieldy thing, or advanced manufacturing or whatever. And we kind of came to the idea that fission and fusion would be interesting. And then we were just kind of talking through co-hosts, and Eric was like, you know Julia DeWall? And I was like, yes, like Julia is the absolute perfect person to do this with. The piece that she wrote on nuclear is one of the reasons that I kind of got into it in the first place. And then she was, he reached out actually, and she was down to do it. And so we had a couple of, kind of get to know each other again and figure out what we want out of the season conversations. And then we just went for it. And I think it was a really good dynamic where like really what I wanted out of a co-host and what I want out of a co-host each season is someone who actually knows what they're talking about in the space and is well connected in the space, because I'm coming in like trying to learn about these spaces I'm excited about, but like maybe don't know as well in terms of both the topic and the people involved. And so really, I think we came to this like pretty good division of labor where she knew everybody in the industry and like was able to bring us so many great guests and had a great perspective on the industry and had done all the research. And so like a lot of the first couple episodes were like us trying to translate and condense what she'd done over the past few years into a couple of hours. And then my role was really like writing the thing. And so we got to a really good division of labor where, I could come with the outside perspective and try to write the scripts and apply that. Whereas we used a lot of her knowledge. And then we got to the fusion half of the season. It was a little bit of a mix of both because that's just like more of a frontier industry generally, and one that I'd spent more time researching. And so I think, I don't know, it was fun for both of us kind of getting to learn some new things throughout.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Well, number one, the arc of the season was fun, informative. I think anyone who listens to it would be well served, whether you think you're pro or anti-nuclear. I'm curious about what were the really important conversations you wanted to have with Julia at the outset? Because sometimes partnerships like this can end up super wacky and kind of fall apart. It's like, what's the division of labor? Who benefits? Whatever. There's all kinds of things that can derail something like this. So what did y'all do up front as, both coming in as experienced operators, having been on teams before, that you knew you wanted to talk about beforehand?
I think one was time commitment. I think that was actually the biggest one for both of us. I think neither of us came into this super financially motivated. In fact, like after the season, when we agreed to just kind of split the thing, split our part of the revenue kind of equally. And then at the end of the season, we had a back and forth email chain. We were both trying to argue that the other person should get more. And so it wasn't about the money. Like we weren't worried about it falling apart for those reasons. It was really like, what are we trying to get across in this? And then what time commitment are we willing to put in? And I think we both ended up putting more time in than we'd expected. And that was totally fine. But it was like, I wish that I could say that like I planned it really well and whatever. And I think it was just that I got like incredibly lucky with this, both, unicorn of a co-host who was, while founding a company and being a mom and like having all this stuff going on, also was willing to commit whatever time it took to make this work. She's just like a machine. She's incredible. And then the team at Turpentine was like, Nancy, our producer, was, I don't think, slept throughout the whole season to make this thing happen. So like, I think we all went in with time expectations and then we all just got hooked and like put in a lot more time than expected. But that was really the biggest thing. And then I think we also, like she was very clear. She like didn't want it to be her company's Antares. Like she didn't want it to be an Antares podcast. She wanted it to be a very like fact-based look at nuclear. When you look at the facts, like nuclear, I think it's like pretty tough actually to be anti-nuclear. I think there's all sorts of reasons to say it doesn't make economic sense. We're not going to be able to get this off the ground quickly enough for it to make an impact. Solar is just getting better and better and better, faster and faster and faster. And we'll figure out reliability and batteries or different things that we can do to make solar baseload. And there are arguments against going for nuclear. I think that being anti-nuclear is just this like very weird, untenable stance that is just like degrowth by another name, but just being aligned on kind of like that commitment to, if we had somebody come on and say that like nuclear didn't make sense, we were going to actually like air that and like be really like, approach the issue seriously, as opposed to like her, if she could have come in, if she were somebody else and been like, no, I'm fundraising for a nuclear company right now. Like we have to say that this is going to be like the best way to make money of all time. And that was not it at all. We were both committed to like giving as straightforward a story as possible, because definitely something I've learned from the newsletter, like people are very, very, very sensitive to bullshit and like can really, really tell when you're not telling the truth. And so finding someone who I think wanted to put in the work and at least like wanted to, tell the fairest story possible was really important.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an investor. If I were an investor, I'd be looking for intellectual honesty in founders I invest in. And so there is some amount of like understanding the downsides, anything that you're doing, whether it's nuclear or something else, where it engenders trust. It's like when you can communicate transparently and fully about a topic from end to end, positive to negative, I think people trust it more, because it's fact-based. There's this whole other identity-based thing where people adopt causes as part of their identity that we don't have to go down, but like there's definitely that in nuclear, where it's like being anti-nuclear or pro-nuclear
totally
becomes an identity. It's like, is your heart made of a reactor? What is happening? It's very odd.
There is some, I think probably like the way I am with Optimism, some just like on the pro-nuclear side, I'm going to defend them, but like there is some like, what am I like? Are you people crazy? Like you almost like feel like you're yelling into the void. And so like, I can see why it would be frustrating to be for nuclear and like why you fight so hard for it. But yeah, I mean, like, You see this in crypto, you see this in energy, like anywhere you look, there's like maximalism around a certain thing, and you like fight over like slices of the pie versus just trying to like grow the pie and figure out how to all be on the same team. And that makes it fun. And again, if you're going to like be pro free markets, like this is part of the whole game, and it's totally fine. I think I've like, tied my identity a little bit to nuclear at this point, but like nobody in the world would be happier than me if solar ended up just like solving all of our energy needs. Like that would be amazing. Like that is the goal. The goal is not any one particular like way of getting there.
Right. So one more thing on the nuclear topic. So I teamed up with a mentor of mine to make a book about climate change after I left ConvertKit. It's called The Carbon Almanac. It was a fact-based book about climate change to try and hand it to people who are still in the middle, who like don't want to feel stupid. They're not really sure what they think, and they're not really sure where to go to get up to speed. That was like the purpose of the book. It's an all-volunteer team. And so we wrote about many things, but nuclear was one of them. And one of the things that was most surprising to me as we dug into the data was how few deaths per unit of energy from nuclear there have been relative to other technologies, and like how much more deadly oil and gas are as an energy production system because of pollutants, accidents, like any number of things. And even the renewable technologies like nuclear is like the third best in terms of deaths per energy produced. So that was one of the things that surprised me, and it caused me to update my priors because like many people, I had in the back of my mind like all the accidents and the sensationalism and all of that. And like it would be scary to be a person at the site of a nuclear meltdown would be very scary. I would be freaked out for the rest of my short life at that point. Also, that rarely happens. So taking that one for granted, because I just said it, not because it's obvious to everyone, nuclear is very safe. What else was surprising to you about nuclear as you went through the season that maybe you didn't expect going in?
That's a really good question. I mean, that was the same chart that we both looked at. I think that made me think, I was never anti-nuclear, but like really made me think like, what is going on here?
What are we doing here? Yeah.
Like 0.03 deaths per terawatt hour. I think right above solar and tied with wind or something is like the safest, and coal is up at like 38 deaths per terawatt or something. Like, so that one is absolutely crazy. Nuclear waste as like a total non-issue was a big one to me. And like this whole chicken and egg of like making it really hard to dispose of nuclear waste and then saying like, oh, you have no way of disposing of nuclear waste. Like this whole thing is totally unsafe. There's definitely like me coming in with my prior assumptions on some of this, but just like how much, I think we did a lot of work to try to blame something other than regulation. And like, certainly there are a host of factors that go into it. They're long projects, they're bespoke construction as opposed to something that you can manufacture and like get experience curves on, although people are working on that. Skilled labor, financing, there was this whole demand kind of like curve misprediction in the 1970s that meant there was an overabundance of nuclear projects that didn't get finished. And so it killed utilities. Utilities end up being a bad buyer for modern technology. Like there's a million different kind of reasons that nuclear is tough to make work economically. But I think so much of it still comes down to like, to the regulation and to like how absurd the standards are. Whether that's radiation is low as reasonably achievable, which ALARA is like this totally imprecise, which means you can kind of wield it however you want against nuclear standard for how much radiation there should be and how much radiation, like how little radiation nuclear plants actually give off. I think that was surprising to me, but there's like that kind of regulation. And then there's the environmental review stuff that can just like put these projects, like all the things that come kind of downstream of that, then the projects take longer, then you can't do as many of them as predictably. And like all the issues kind of stem from just how hard we've made it to build this miracle technology. And there's a million reasons. There's the degrowth side. There's, if you're the oil and gas industry, like, of course you want to do everything that you can to fund research that shows that radiation is actually really bad and is going to make your baby's teeth fall out, because it is just like this source of energy that has all sorts of advantages if you can get it on the grid kind of cheaply and reliably. But just like how much of an interconnected mess building nuclear was surprising to me, but I don't think any of it's intractable. I just don't exactly know how you just cut through that regulatory knot, but I think that's a really important place to start.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the point of podcasts like this and just more education around it is you need public support.
Yep.
I think the regulatory environment is probably reflective of public sentiment, which is partly reflective of the people who have incentives for nuclear not to move forward. I don't want to go down that whole like pro anti nuclear thing. I think for me, the podcast and the topic of nuclear is a great example. It's kind of like a Rorschach test for people to see, like, do you actually have intellectual curiosity, or do you have pre-existing beliefs that you're trying to confirm? Because many people probably have a default on the topic. And my like 2 cents on this would be, go listen to the show, like knowing that you're listening to two people who are default pro-nuclear coming in for the most part, and just see what you think on the other side. And then go use it as a jumping off point to do your own research and learn more. What do you have to lose? Sometimes I think we get so locked into viewpoints that we don't even go learn about why we might be wrong.
It's hard to navigate to. Like, I think it is. Like, there is a lot of information on both sides of it. Some true, some false. To your point, some way overly negative, some way overly optimistic that doesn't confront the realities of how hard it is to build new nuclear. And so, like, that's really what I want to do with each one of these seasons. Is certainly there's going to be a bit of a bias in every season that we do. I'm not going to choose a topic that I'm not excited about. And it's called Age of Miracles because I think these are the technologies that can like get us to an age of miracles. But I want it to be a spot where you can like at least kind of get up to speed on the basic facts and kind of like the current viewpoints of people in the industry in as quick a time as possible without being so quick as to like glance over the important details.
Yeah. All right. In the interest of time, I have 3 questions I always end with. Maybe I'll get you back on the line for a little sub-segment on like how we got our ass kicked by Substack another time, just because I'm like fascinated in it. But I think that's the only thing we didn't cover that I was hoping to. That and you working with your brother, but you talk about that some publicly anyways. Okay. In the spirit of what you just said, which is like founders going back and saying, oh, and the thing you missed, what's the one question that you always wish people would ask you in conversations like this that you never get to answer? And then give us your answer.
There's none. Like, I think we've really covered a lot of great stuff. Like, yeah, I'm sure you've like picked this up reading stuff. Like, I'm just like very like happy to be reactive to the conversation or like participate in the thing. But like, there's not a thing that I'm like hiding from the world that like, I'm just waiting for someone to ask, because I just like, I have to write something every week. Like everything that I've wanted to put out into the world or like that I've thought of is already out there in an essay or something. And then like the fun part about doing a really like well-researched podcast like this one is that there are questions that I couldn't think of. It's a cop-out answer, but I also think it's true that like everything that I can think of to ask myself, I like end up writing an essay about.
It's on
and then your job is to think of questions that I haven't thought of yet.
I love it. Okay, well, I'll ask you one that I didn't get to then, which is like Pooja and your wife and your brother, Dan, right? Is your brother's name?
Yep.
Feel like the unsung heroes but you like sing from the rooftops about them. So I don't want to say that you don't appreciate them, but I just want to maybe give you like a minute to talk about the role they've played in this whole thing.
Whew. That's a huge, I mean, like, yeah, I've written a little bit about Pooja before and her role in this. One, just like, again, like we're pregnant. I quit my job, no income. And she's like, yeah, I trust you to go out and write this thing. Like, do you plan on making money at any point? Like, it'd be cool if you could like figure it out, but like, I trust you. Like that, you know, confidence there was massive. And then over the past 4 years, like I essentially have been like, hey, it's the weekend. It'd be like really great if I could. I mean, I've gotten better at just being like, it'd be really great if I could write. But like even before, she'd be like, she bends over backwards to figure out how to make sure that I have time to like actually write or even like sit around and like do the dumb stuff that I have to do. Like just scroll Twitter for a while or like read or like all the stuff that seems like so luxurious and counterproductive and feels frankly like luxurious and counterproductive. That's all part of the process while we have 2 kids. And she's just like the greatest mom to the kids. And like, I have like, you can just like see her in them. Like, I don't know, none of this is possible without all of that while she's like also working and like doing all the things around the house that I like just making sure that our life doesn't fall apart because I'm like kind of aloof on all of that kind of stuff. And she's great at like, yeah, like this, I'm just not able to do this. I'd be like that stereotypical engineer's room with a mattress on the floor and like garbage everywhere. That's what my life would look like if she were not in it. So yeah, she is the unsung hero here. And then Dan, we sing about Dan a lot more because he's been directly involved, but from like the very beginning when I was making no money on it, certainly not paying him, he's edited every single piece that I've written, like some really awful drafts, and like has been, I think, really great at giving just this direct feedback that I don't think another person would be able to give me, because he's my brother. He's written the Weekly Dose of Optimism for the majority of its life. And it's something that, like, people will reach out and be like, I like the essays, but like, I love the Weekly Dose of Optimism. And so like the fact that he's been able to do that while running a business that just passed $1 million in monthly revenue, and it's just like, could not be happier for the success of Not Boring. And I couldn't be happier for the success of Create. So yeah, without the two of them and just our families I mean, my in-laws let us live with them and like watch the kids, and my parents watch, like it is a group effort that I get to be the beneficiary of, and like sit in the room and read and mess around on the internet. So yeah, very, very fortunate.
I love that. Yeah. There's a whole thread of multi-generational living that is part of my life that I wanted to get down to that we didn't get to. So another day, part 2. Okay. My second to last question is always, well, I'm going to read a quote to you first because it gets at exactly my second to last question normally. So in one of your essays, you said, it was from Blank Page, write a speech or a story about the thing you want to create or the future world you want to inhabit. Paint that world in details so rich using the present tense that it feels like you already live there. Imagine the magical technology that's become so ordinary that people just use it every day without a second thought. How do people behave in this world? What's changed about them? What's stayed the same? Then reverse engineer it. And this felt a lot like kind of the conversation we were having, where it's like, go imagine what you want to exist and then figure out what part of that you can build. I'm just curious, like, what is that for you? What is the version of the future that you're hoping for, that like you're trying to push us towards?
Like, it's tough to follow my own advice on this. And I did it. Like I wrote, like when I introduced Age of Miracles, I wrote like a picture of what one version of that world might be like, a world where the things that people build today end up resulting in this really amazing life where people still feel fulfilled and like find new things to do with their time. If AI takes their like current job, and we'll look back on the current jobs and be like, I can't believe people did that for work, whatever. But you get to spend more time doing the things that you want to do, and you get to spend more time with your friends and family. And there's more people around the world who continue to not just get lifted out of poverty, but have like a really great standard of living. Like, I just think that these things are possible and inevitable. And like, you're going to look back at the world in 2023 at some point in the future and be like, wow, that was like a quaint, weird, barbaric, and I can't believe people did X, Y, and Z thing. So getting to that good world sooner. And I also think that like the way that you approach it and the way that you approach new technologies, and if you villainize technologists or if you celebrate and support but engage on like the real challenges that they present, like that really impacts, I think, how the world changes. I think we can get there faster if we embrace and support, but we get there in like a cleaner way that more people are involved in. If a quarter, 3/4 of the world haven't been scared off of adopting new technologies and try to fight the change and all of that type of stuff. Like, these are all really complex issues that I don't have the answer to, but if I can try to like translate my enthusiasm for the things that I'm seeing into a way that's understandable for people, in a way that they can see it, how it would positively impact their lives, and maybe learn a little bit more, or maybe like start experimenting with things that they might not otherwise have experimented with, or support things that they wouldn't have otherwise supported. Like, that's the best that I can hope to do on the writing side. And on the investing side, if I can explain these crazy things that people are doing in a way that makes their thing even just like the slightest bit more likely to come true and contribute to that world, then that's amazing.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, it's what's attracted me to your work. And generally, I think I'm drawn to people who see their work as a way to shape the world into something better long term. It's like work is a core outlet for that. My last question is also about how the work shapes us. We go out and we want to shape things to make them better, build something more impactful, more interesting, more hopeful. And at the same time, it changes us as we grow. And so I wonder, as you do your work at Not Boring, who you're becoming as a person through the work.
I don't know if I'm like a better or worse person for it, or like, I certainly read a whole lot more and get to meet a whole lot more smart people, but I don't know. I think it's just like, it's fueled my curiosity from a spot where like I didn't know what I wanted to do outside of work, to a spot where like I'm just fascinated by like almost too many things at this point. I think it can make me like way too myopic about like my, doing my research and like sitting in front of my computer and like making sure that I have enough time. So I need to like actively like fight against that actually, and like try to get out into the world more and like have more random conversations and things that aren't related to work at all, and like all of that kind of stuff. But I think overall, like getting to do this and getting to meet more and more smart people just made me want to get smarter myself and like get better, sharpen my tools to better help the people who I actually think can make the real impact on things. So I don't know. It's like made me want to be, it's going to sound like way too cheesy, but like, it's like made me want to be better at like the very specific things that I'm good at so that I can help the people who are good at specific things that I think are more valuable to the world.
Yeah. I've embraced my cheesiness. I had to get to the point where it was like, you know what? Someone wants to dunk on me for being like naively altruistic, then go for it. No, I'll give you that one, you know?
For sure.
I think on some level, I want to have conversations with people who like, that's actually what's driving them and who they're becoming. So my little like love letter to Not Boring, just as we close, is I think you've built an incredible body of work over a relatively short period of time. I mean, I know it's felt probably like a lifetime, the 4 years you've been doing it, but I'm so inspired by it. It informs me about a wide array of things. I look forward to getting it. I got featured in one of the weekly doses of Optimism. So that felt awesome. Yeah, man, I just hope you keep going. I think it's going to be so awesome for your kids to see you promoting the kinds of ideas and the kind of hopefulness and optimism that you do. And I hope they never take it for granted because I think it's doing a lot of good. And I hope that, I just hope you don't stop.
Dude, you just made my day and my week. This was, I mean, yeah, I think you're onto something here because this is as deep and fun and well-researched and planned conversation as I've had. Yeah, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Good Work. I'm your host and the creator of the show, Barrett Brooks, and the show is produced by my friends over at Podcast Royale. If you enjoyed this show, make sure to hit subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else. Love to have you as a regular follower of the show. My guest today was Packy McCormick. You can find all of his work and especially his writing at notboring.co. You can find The Age of Miracles wherever you get podcasts, and you can follow him on Twitter. Surprise, surprise, because I love Twitter. But Packy's a great follow there. He's super entertaining and kind and fun to interact with. So make sure to check him out in all those places. And of course, as always, you can find all of the show notes, key takeaways, clips, quotes, links, and everything else you could want at goodworkshow.com. All past episodes and all past show notes can always be found there. So make sure to check out goodworkshow.com if you enjoyed this episode. If you got this far, it means you probably enjoyed the conversation. If that's the case, I'd love you to do two things. First of all, I'd love you to grab the link to this episode and text it to a friend. Share it with one other person who might enjoy it that probably hasn't heard it before. You'll be a tastemaker, they'll get entertainment, and it'll bring you closer together, and it'll help more people find the show. The second thing you can do is you can leave a review in Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, or even just a comment on YouTube. The algorithms love engagement like this because it takes extra effort and it shows that people care. That means more people can find the show, it boosts me up, and it helps me continue to reach new people with what I hope is great content that you enjoy. Thanks again for listening today. Next week, what you can look forward to is an interview with one of my best friends in the world. His name's Ryan Delk. He's been a longtime startup operator. I think he got to Silicon Valley when he was like 12, not really 12, but something like 18 or 19. And he's been building companies ever since. His latest venture is called Primer, where he's looking to reinvent the education system by taking principles from homeschooling, online schooling, and microschooling and bringing them all together to give the best possible educational experience, both for students and for the teachers at the head of the classroom. They've got a really inventive approach that they take, and Ryan has been in the startup ecosystem for a very long time. I think you're going to love hearing his story and his perspective on leadership, so look forward to that next week. Thanks again for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you next time.